What most people misunderstand about empaths is this. They assume the issue is social skill, that somehow if an empath has few or no friends, it must be because they simply do not know how to connect with others. But that is not just inaccurate, it is completely backwards. Empaths do not lack connection skills at all. In fact, they often operate at a level of emotional perception that most people never reach in their entire lives. They read tone, micro-expressions, and the subtle inconsistencies between spoken words and actual feelings. They do not just hear what is said out loud, they register what is meant, what is hidden underneath, and what is actively avoided. And that intense level of awareness changes the entire social experience from the ground up. Because once you see beneath the surface consistently, everyday surface-level interaction starts to feel empty. Small talk is not just boring to an empath, it is disorienting. It feels like participating in something completely artificial, like everyone else agreed to stay on the surface while pretending that true depth is not available anywhere. Conversations become entirely predictable. Reactions feel heavily rehearsed. Emotional exchanges completely lack sincerity. And over time, this creates a quiet but persistent sense of deep disconnect. So, the empath faces a crucial choice, whether they consciously realize it or not. Do they keep engaging in interactions that feel shallow and completely misaligned just to maintain social volume and fit in? Or do they step back and wait for something real to come along? Most choose to step back, and that is where the misunderstanding begins with everyone else. From the outside, it looks like withdrawal. It looks like isolation, but internally it is not driven by fear or social anxiety. It is driven by pure discernment. Empaths are not looking for more conversations to fill their time. They are looking for honest ones. They are not interested in being surrounded by large crowds. They are interested in being truly understood. And once they realize how rare that level of understanding actually is, their personal standards naturally rise. This is where the social circle starts to shrink over time. Not because people are actively rejecting them, but because they quietly opt out of interactions that do not meet a certain baseline of authenticity. They stop forcing laughter at jokes that are not funny. They stop pretending interest in things that do not matter. They stop investing precious energy into dynamics that feel one-dimensional and hollow. And here is the part that most people miss entirely. This is not a loss at all. It is a natural filtration process. The empath is not becoming less social or antisocial. They are becoming more precise, more intentional, and far more aligned with what actually fulfills them instead of what simply occupies their time. But there is a real cost to that precision. Depth is rare. Genuine emotional presence is rare. People who are comfortable being seen clearly and who can see others clearly in return are simply not the majority. So when an empath raises their threshold for connection, the number of people who can meet them at that level drops significantly. And they know that. They understand, often without needing to put it into words, that choosing depth means accepting solitude more often than other people do. But to them, that trade-off makes complete sense, because being alone does not feel nearly as heavy as being surrounded by people who do not truly see you for who you are. So they become comfortable in that space, not because they do not value relationships, but because they value real ones far too much to ever settle for anything less. And when you understand that, everything changes. The narrative shifts from why do they not have more friends to a much more accurate question, which is how many people are actually capable of meeting them at the level they live on. Because when someone is wired for depth, surface-level connection does not just feel insufficient, it feels genuinely dishonest. And most people would rather have company than truth. An empath would rather have truth than company. Next piece of this dynamic becomes even more practical, and in many ways even more misunderstood. When we say empaths absorb energy, it can sound abstract, almost mystical to some, but there is a very real psychological and biological mechanism behind it. Empaths are highly attuned to emotional states, not just in a cognitive way, but in a deeply physiological one as well. Their nervous system responds rapidly and directly to the emotional cues of other people around them. Tone shifts, tension in posture, and subtle changes in breathing patterns. These are not just observed from a distance, they are physically felt within their own body. And when you are around someone who is anxious, frustrated, manipulative, or emotionally chaotic, your body begins to mirror that exact state, whether you consciously intend to or not. So over time, social interaction stops being neutral territory. It becomes costly. This is where the pattern starts to form in their daily lives. An empath spends time in a group setting or even just one-on-one and walks away feeling deeply drained, not tired in the normal physical sense, but depleted, like something vital has been taken away rather than exchanged. At first, they do not always understand why this happens. They may assume it is just standard introversion or temporary stress from work. But as the pattern repeats itself over and over, the underlying cause becomes crystal clear. It is not the mere presence of people that drains them. It is the quality of emotional energy those specific people carry into the space. And here is where it gets even more precise. Most people regulate their internal state independently without outside help. An empath, on the other hand, often regulates in direct response to their environment. That means if they are surrounded by unresolved tension in the room, they feel it deeply. If they are around negativity, they process it inside themselves. If someone is masking their insecurity or hidden anger, the empath picks up on the mismatch immediately, and their internal system works tirelessly to reconcile it. That is effort. Constant and invisible effort, day in and day out. Now imagine doing that across multiple relationships, across days, weeks, and years of your life. Eventually, the empath reaches a point where their internal system starts to push back. Not emotionally out of anger, but strategically out of survival. They begin to reduce exposure to these situations. They start declining invitations. They limit the duration of conversations. They become much more selective about where they actually go, who they choose to see, and how long they stay in a room. Not because they have lost interest in people altogether, but because they have recognized a persistent pattern of energetic imbalance. This is where outsiders often completely misread the situation. It looks like withdrawal, avoidance, or even cold disinterest. But in reality, it is a healthy form of calibration. The empath is simply learning how to protect their core baseline. Because once you become aware that certain environments consistently disrupt your internal state of peace, continuing to expose yourself to them is not kindness toward others. It is negligence toward yourself. And empaths, especially after experiencing enough of this, stop neglecting themselves entirely. They start asking completely different questions about their connections. Instead of asking, how do I maintain this relationship at all costs, the question becomes, what does this interaction actually cost me? And is it truly worth it in the end? That single mental shift changes everything about how they navigate the world. And here is the critical point that most people miss. Most people do not even measure their relationships this way at all. They measure them based on history, family obligation, or simple physical proximity. Empaths measure their relationships based on direct impact. How do I actually feel during this interaction while it is happening? How do I feel after it is over and I am by myself? Is there a sense of mutual regulation happening? Or am I the one constantly stabilizing the dynamic for everyone else in the room? When the answer to that question becomes consistently one-sided, the empath does not argue or make a scene. They simply adjust their presence, protect their energy, and redirect their focus toward the rare spaces and people where authentic, balanced, and meaningful connection is actually possible. They adjust themselves. This is precisely why their social circle gets much smaller over time, yet becomes far more stable than it ever was before. Fewer people around them, less unnecessary chaos, fewer draining interactions, and infinitely more clarity in their day-to-day life. They are not trying to maximize social contact or win a popularity contest. They are trying to optimize their internal equilibrium and protect their peace. And once they experience what it truly feels like to be around someone who does not drain them, someone who is grounded, genuinely self-aware, and emotionally consistent, that stark contrast becomes completely undeniable. It raises their personal standard permanently. At that point, their tolerance for exhausting and draining dynamics drops down to near zero. So what looks like distance from the outside is actually careful refinement. What looks like isolation is actually conscious control. The empath is not retreating away from people out of fear, they are simply eliminating unnecessary interference from their environment. As it has often been noted, when your internal state is constantly influenced by your surroundings, protecting that environment becomes a top priority rather than a mere preference. And the underlying truth is simple. If being around someone consistently leaves you feeling worse than you did before you met them, that is not real connection. That is consumption. If you follow this pattern far enough in life, you start to see a third factor emerge, and this one is less about biological wiring and more about hard-earned life experience. Because it is not just that empaths feel deeply or pick up on energy naturally. It is that over time they learn the hard way what happens when those unique traits are placed in the wrong environments with the wrong people. Empaths tend to operate with an extraordinarily high degree of tolerance. They always give people the benefit of the doubt. They rationalize bad behavior instead of calling it out. They look deeply for context, for underlying pain, and for reasons that might explain why someone acted the way they did. And in isolation, that is not a weakness at all. That is advanced social intelligence. But in the real world, that wonderful ability often gets misused and taken advantage of. Because when you consistently understand other people much better than they even understand themselves, you also become much easier to overlook and take for granted. Your boundaries slowly become flexible. Your incredible patience becomes an expected standard. And your willingness to stay, even when something feels fundamentally off, creates a persistent imbalance that other people, whether consciously or not, quickly learn to rely on. So the empath gives even more of themselves. They listen longer to complaints. They forgive much faster than others. They carry heavy emotional weight that was never assigned to them in the first place, but they pick it up anyway, simply because they have the capacity to bear it. And for a little while, it seems to work. The relationship continues forward. The connection appears stable on the surface. But underneath that fragile surface, there is a growing and unsustainable asymmetry. One person is investing all their energy, while the other person is merely consuming it. Now, this is where the dynamic finally shifts. Because eventually, constant repetition creates undeniable clarity. The empath starts to notice recurring patterns, not just isolated incidents or bad days, but consistent behavioral dynamics. They begin to see that certain people only show up when they need something from them. They realize that apologies never lead to actual change. They see that their deep understanding is not being reciprocated at all, but rather depended upon as a crutch. And this is a critical turning point because at this exact moment, the empath has enough clear data to make a different decision about their life. The real question is whether they will choose to act on it. Some people do not make the change immediately. They stay much longer than they should, desperately hoping that insight will eventually lead to personal transformation in the other person. But over time, even that persistent hope starts to erode away. Not because they have become bitter or cynical, but because they have simply become accurate in their assessment. They finally realize that understanding someone else does not obligate you to tolerate poor treatment from them. And once that vital distinction becomes crystal clear in their mind, their behavior changes very quickly. The empath stops over-explaining themselves. They stop trying to justify other people's toxic actions. They stop trying to manage outcomes that were never theirs to control in the first place. And most importantly, they stop giving at a level that is not being matched in return. This is often the exact moment where the people around them become deeply confused and frustrated. Because the empath who was once always available, always patient, and always accommodating suddenly is not there anymore. But what looks like a sudden personality change to outsiders is actually just a healthy boundary correction. They have not become colder inside. They have simply become more precise. They are no longer responding automatically out of habit or guilt. They are responding selectively out of awareness. And that single shift disrupts every single relationship dynamic that was built entirely on their previous overextension. Some relationships inevitably fall apart at this stage. Not because the empath did something wrong or malicious, but because the relationship was never truly balanced to begin with. It was solely sustained by their willingness to carry more than their fair share of the emotional load. And once that willingness is permanently removed, the whole structure collapses under its own weight. This is precisely why their social circle often shrinks so dramatically during this phase. Because when you stop overgiving to everyone, you also stop being compatible with people who are only benefiting from your generosity. And there are far more of those one-sided people in the world than most care to realize. But here is the part that truly matters. This is not a loss in the traditional sense. It is an exposure. It clearly reveals which connections were genuinely mutual and which ones were entirely conditional. And for the empath, that hard-earned clarity is well worth the reduction in numbers. Because once you have experienced what it feels like to be used, misunderstood, or emotionally depleted in a pattern, not just for a fleeting moment, but as a lifestyle, you never unlearn that lesson. You fully integrate it into your worldview. You become much harder to manipulate, much harder to access without genuine intention, and far more aware of where your precious energy is going and why. So, when you look at an empath who has very few people around them, understand that you are not looking at someone who failed to build healthy relationships. You are looking at someone who learned through painful repetition which relationships were never real to begin with. And the final conclusion they arrive at is simple, but certainly not easy to live out. Empathy without solid boundaries is not true kindness. It is self-abandonment. If you take everything we have discussed so far, prioritizing depth over surface-level talk, heightened sensitivity to energy, and the tough lessons learned through being overextended, it all leads to one final shift in life priority. And this is where the empath fundamentally separates from the majority of people around them. At some point, they stop asking, how do I maintain this connection, and start asking what kind of life actually feels right and authentic to live. That single question changes the entire framework of their existence. Because most everyday social behavior is unconsciously driven by an underlying need for social validation and fitting in. People stay in boring conversations they do not enjoy, stay in unfulfilling relationships, and endure environments that completely exhaust them, all just to maintain a basic sense of belonging. There is a hidden trade being made every single day, trading true authenticity in exchange for cheap social acceptance. Empaths eventually become fully aware of that unfair trade, and more importantly, they start to outright reject it, not in a loud, dramatic, or confrontational way, but through a quiet, deliberate internal recalibration. They begin to notice that every single time they ignore their internal warning signals, every time they tolerate unnecessary noise, tension, or superficiality just to keep the peace, their own sense of inner peace deteriorates rapidly. And over time, that cumulative cost becomes far too obvious to ignore any longer. So they make a bold decision that most people avoid for as long as humanly possible. They choose internal alignment over external approval from others. And that is precisely where their lifestyle starts to look remarkably different from the crowd. They spend significantly more time alone, but it never feels like deprivation or loneliness. It feels like pure clarity. Without constant external input and chaotic noise from others, their thoughts finally settle down. Their emotions stabilize into a calm state. Their overall awareness sharpens. They are no longer bending over backward, adjusting themselves to match a toxic environment. Instead, they are simply allowing the environment to reveal whether it naturally matches who they are. That is a complete reversal of control in their life. And once that happens, the desperate need to be liked by everyone begins to lose its grip and influence over them. Not because they have become cold and indifferent to humanity, but because they have experienced something far more valuable than cheap social approval. They have found coherence. The deep feeling that who they are on the inside is no longer in constant conflict with how they are living on the outside. That is an incredible level of psychological consistency that most people rarely reach in a lifetime. Now, from the outside looking in, this can easily be misinterpreted by others. People may assume the empath has suddenly become distant, emotionally detached, or even arrogant. But those surface-level interpretations usually come from individuals who are still blindly operating within the old approval-based framework. To them, choosing personal peace over social participation just does not make any sense. But to the empath, it is not even a question worth debating anymore because they have already tested the alternative path. They have spent years in those crowded rooms, engaged in constant empty conversations, and maintained relationships purely out of old habit rather than genuine alignment. And they have seen the final result of that path, which is simply more noise, more confusion, and more internal conflict. So they choose to simplify their world. They drastically reduce unnecessary social interaction. They become highly selective about who they allow into their personal space, not out of fear or hatred of people, but out of profound respect for their own mental and emotional well-being. They prioritize environments that feel genuinely calm, grounded, and authentic. In doing so, something remarkably interesting happens over time. Their relationships, while far fewer in number, become significantly more stable and rewarding. There is a lot less forced performance, less misunderstanding, and far less emotional volatility in their daily life. The connections they do choose to maintain are firmly based on mutual awareness rather than burdensome social obligation. There is plenty of space for comfortable silence without any awkwardness, and total honesty without negative consequences. That is their new standard. And once that high standard is officially set in stone, there is zero incentive to ever go backward. Because the empath has finally realized something that most people spend decades trying to avoid. Being surrounded by the wrong group of people is a far more subtle, yet far more damaging form of discomfort than simply being by yourself. One form of discomfort is obvious and temporary, while the other is constant and cumulative. So they choose their company very carefully, not aiming for perfection, but living consciously. And that is the ultimate distinction. Their life is no longer built around reacting to whatever social availability happens to be around them. It is built entirely around responding to what is truly aligned with their soul. Every single interaction, every relationship, and every environment is carefully filtered through one simple question. Does this particular thing contribute to my inner peace, or does it actively disrupt it? If it disrupts their peace, it simply does not stay in their life. And that is the real reason why their social circle looks the way it does to outsiders. It is not empty at all. It is beautifully refined. Because in the very end, the empath is not searching desperately for more people to crowd their world. They are actively protecting something far more valuable than that. They are protecting their state of mind and their sacred energy. And once you truly understand the immense value of that, you stop chasing superficial connection and you start choosing real alignment.